Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. There was something remarkably unremarkable about Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt, a woman of orderly habits and quiet routine. She prided herself on a clean parlor, predictable tea times, and a general air of proper, if modest, domesticity. It was during the annual spring clean, a ritual she undertook with the solemnity of a minor liturgy, that she discovered it. She had rolled back the oriental rug in the sitting room with a sharp tug, intent on giving the floorboards a good polish, when she stopped, cloth in hand, and blinked. A stain. Faint, rust-colored and oddly shaped. It nestled just left of center beneath, where the rug had lain for years, distorted slightly by the grain of the old wood. She knelt to inspect it further, brushing her hand over it, as though contact might reveal more. It was too dark for wine, too oddly contoured to be the result of spilt jam or polish. And though Mrs. Harcourt had no scientific leanings, nor the faintest idea of blood in its later states, something within her recoiled in quiet recognition. Of course, she told herself, it was surely nothing, some long-forgotten spill. The Colonel had lived in the house before her, a reclusive and peculiar gentleman, long deceased. His housekeeping had, from all village accounts, left much to be desired. And yet something about the stain's very placement unsettled her. Too central, too deliberately hidden beneath the largest piece of floor covering. She had been the tenant of Ivy Bank House for 6 years now. The house had character, certainly. A touch drafty, a bit high-ceilinged in the study. But it suited her. And it had history. The sort spoken of in little dithering only over soft clinks of teacups and the slow stirring of sugar. Later that afternoon, after a fair amount of internal debate, Mrs. Harcourt found herself walking the cobbled path to St. Mary Mead's ivy-wrapped cottage, the one with the neat garden and the gentle scent of lavender. She had not come intending to make much of a fuss, merely to borrow a pie dish, she told herself. But the words spilled out like water through cupped fingers. Miss Marple listened with her customary mild expression, hands folded in her lap, eyes bright beneath soft white curls. She asked nothing at first, merely inclined her head gently when Mrs. Harcourt described the stain, the rug, the peculiarity of it all. Then, with a softness that never sought attention, she said, I once took tea in that very sitting room. Colonel Templeton was an odd man, rather fond of dramatic storytelling, though none of his tales ever quite added up. Mrs. Harcourt was startled. You knew him? Oh, not well. He had a fondness for showing guests his collection of naval swords, though I always suspected he'd never seen salt water in his life. He had a housemaid once, Clara, I believe. Vanished rather suddenly, if memory serves. She paused, her voice thoughtful. Rather a shame. I do hope she found happiness elsewhere. There was something in Miss Marple's tone, not quite curiosity, not quite certainty, that lingered in the air like a whisper. She set down her teacup with care, and asked ever so politely if she might call in the morning to see the stain herself. Mrs. Harcourt agreed, relieved perhaps that she no longer carried the burden of puzzlement alone. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived promptly at 10. She examined the stain quietly, bending with surprising grace, fingers gliding across the warped edges of the floorboard. Her touch was light, respectful, almost reverent. She did not speak for some time. When at last she straightened, her expression was calm. but her eyes had narrowed in that way that made the village instinctively hush. "No one ever cleans under the past," she said softly, "but it waits all the same." Mrs. Harcourt blinked. "Do you think it might be something serious?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She merely looked again at the faint stain, then back at the rug, and added almost as an afterthought, "I should like to ask a few questions. Nothing troublesome, of course. Just memories. They have a curious way of turning up when least expected." And with that, a story long buried beneath woven fibers and polite silence began to stir. Daniel Claiborne arrived on a Monday morning, as discreetly as a shadow moving across polished wood. He carried a satchel worn at the corners, a collection of notebooks, and the kind of manner that rarely startled anyone. Soft-spoken, polite, and observant to the point of invisibility. His letter of introduction had preceded him by a week, addressed to Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt, expressing a keen interest in the architectural evolution of small English country houses, particularly those with ties to minor military families. It was, by all accounts, a wholly uncontroversial subject. Yet within days of his arrival, a hush of discomfort settled upon the villagers of Little Dithering. He did not make demands, nor did he press rudely. But Daniel asked questions, the kind that prodded at memory's attic, lifting old dust where many preferred it remain. He inquired about Colonel Templeton, formerly of Ivy Bank House, and sought clarification on his early years, his movements after the war, and the abrupt cessation of household staff some 25 years prior. He spoke to the vicar, to the grocer, even to Miss Parsons, the retired music teacher, who had once played the organ at a garden party hosted by the Colonel. Each conversation was polite, brief, and unsettling in its own way. There was nothing overtly alarming about his inquiries. And yet, as Miss Marple noted to herself with quiet certainty, it is rarely the content of a question that unsettles. It is its timing. Mrs. Harcourt, who had offered Daniel the upstairs room on recommendation from the vicar's wife, had taken an initial liking to the young man. He was courteous, unobtrusive, and always arrived precisely 5 minutes early for tea. But as the week progressed, she began to sense a nervous energy in the house, something brittle, like fine china close to cracking. Daniel's questions grew more precise. Had Mrs. Harcourt ever noticed anything unusual about the floorboards? Had there been any surviving correspondence from the Colonel? Did she know if any of the previous tenants had left suddenly? She answered truthfully. No, she had not. But she began to wonder why he asked. Miss Marple, who had taken to dropping by now, and then under the guise of offering marmalade or collecting a parcel from the post office, observed Daniel with a subtle curiosity of her own. She found his manner deliberate but gentle, like a man walking through a field he suspected might still hold landmines. He treated memory like evidence, dusty but valuable, and handled the elderly with the delicacy of a man used to translating fragile handwriting. One afternoon he paid a visit to Mrs. Dowling, the vicar's wife, who had once served as an assistant to a district nurse. Their conversation was brief, and the contents were not immediately shared with others. But Miss Marple noticed something different in Mrs. Dowling's manner when she passed her on the lane the next morning. A tightness around the mouth, as though a thought had returned that had long been deliberately forgotten. It was not until the 4th day of Daniel's stay that something truly curious occurred. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting and a mild interest in Mrs. Harcourt's tale about ration coupons gone missing in '47, observed Daniel enter the parlor with a slim book in hand. He said nothing for a moment, then politely asked Mrs. Harcourt if she might take another look at the hymnals stacked on the bottom shelf of the bookcase near the fireplace. "I believe," he said, "there may be something inside." Mrs. Harcourt, startled but obliging, watched as he reached between the bindings and produced a small, brittle envelope, yellowed with age and thick with the scent of old paper. Inside was a folded note, unsigned, its ink faded but legible. "She should never have known. What's done is done. It cannot be risked." That evening the atmosphere in the house changed. It was as though the discovery had shifted something. No longer speculative curiosity, but the weight of something real, dark, and unresolved. Mrs. Harcourt confessed to Miss Marple that she now felt vaguely afraid, not of Daniel precisely, but of the questions he carried, questions that had perhaps no safe answers. Miss Marple, for her part, returned home that night, unusually pensive. She reflected on Colonel Templeton, his fondness for uniforms he hadn't earned, his tendency to hold tea parties where he drank sherry instead of Darjeeling. And she remembered Clara, the maid with the pale face and startling green eyes, who had once run out into the lane weeping on a Thursday afternoon. No one had ever spoken of her again. It had been said that she left for a cousin's in Devon, but Miss Marple, who never put full stock in the words, "It's best not to ask," had always suspected otherwise. The next morning Daniel asked if he might meet with Miss Marple privately, for context, as he put it. Over tea he described his academic research, ostensibly a history of gentry life post-war, but admitted quietly that he believed Colonel Templeton had covered up an incident involving a servant girl. He had found whispers in the archives, a cancelled reference letter, a hastily amended will, a small bequest to a CR with no surname. The name Clara had appeared in the margin of a donation ledger. Miss Marple listened with careful stillness. He placed the letter gently on the table between them. "I believe," he said, "that someone in this village knows what happened to her." She did not deny it. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "The trouble with the past, Mr. Claiborne, is that it rarely stays put, especially if someone's gone to such effort to keep it hidden." And with that, the kettle began to whistle, as though sounding a signal neither of them yet fully understood. The vicarage drawing-room was warm with early spring light and the faint scent of lemon polish. The tea things had been laid with care by Mrs. Dowling, who prided herself on maintaining the quiet dignity of a household that still observed proper afternoon tradition. Miss Marple had accepted the invitation with a polite nod, sensing that Mrs. Dowling had more than refreshments in mind. Indeed, whenever a guest list at the vicarage included both the grocer's wife and the retired music mistress, one could expect a subtle probing of village currents. Conversation meandered through appropriate pleasantries, the state of the rose beds, the new curate's unfortunate lisp, and the scandal of shop-bought Madeira cake being passed off as homemade at the Women's Guild. Miss Marple sat serenely with her knitting resting in her lap, her expression composed and faintly amused. Her needles remained still, but her mind did not. At just the moment when the gathering's attentions were flagging, she leaned forward ever so slightly and remarked, quite as though the thought had just occurred to her, "I passed Ivy Bank House the other day. Mrs. Harcourt has been airing the parlor, I believe. It reminded me of Colonel Templeton. Such a curious figure, don't you think?" There was a pause, perceptible only to those accustomed to reading more into silences than into speech. Mrs. Dowling smiled faintly but did not respond. Mrs. Fitch, the grocer's wife, tilted her head as though trying to recall whether she had ever had reason to think well of the man. Miss Parsons, for once, said nothing at all. The temperature of the room seemed to shift imperceptibly. It was not hostility that answered Miss Marple's comment. It was caution, the sort of quiet unease that falls upon those who remember something, but wish they did not. The kind of pause that speaks not of respect, but of hesitation. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed the silence to settle, for it is within such silences that truth so often breathes. With the mildest of tones and the gentlest of intentions, Miss Marple spoke again. "I recall the Colonel had a maid once. Clara, was it? A quiet girl. She brought me a tray when I visited years ago. Rather a pretty creature, as I remember." The second silence was heavier than the first. Mrs. Dowling shifted in her seat, her teacup rattling faintly as it met the saucer. Miss Parsons cleared her throat, but whatever she might have said was swallowed by hesitation. It was Mrs. Fitch who finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Yes, there was a Clara, though I don't believe she stayed very long." "No," murmured Miss Parsons at last. "No, she didn't." No one asked why. It was not the absence of affection that struck Miss Marple. It was the collective agreement not to elaborate. In a village as old as Little Dithering, memory is seldom impartial, but it is rarely unanimous in its avoidance. Clara had not simply left. She had been erased, gently and with the sort of care one reserves for an uncomfortable truth. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift once more to safer shores, marrow chutney and the uncertainty of April weather. But her mind lingered on that shadowed name, Clara, a girl who had once walked those rooms, brought the tea, and vanished without explanation. There had been no farewell, no fuss, no inquiry. And yet Miss Marple knew the residue of injustice when it hung in the air. Like the scent of smoke, long after the fire has been extinguished, it clung faintly to the edges of the conversation, daring no one to name its source. But Miss Marple had always been one to follow such scents, quietly, patiently, until the fire was named. It was quite by accident that the cup was broken. Mrs. Dowling, ever gracious, had risen to replenish the teapot when her sleeve brushed against the corner of the tray. The cup toppled, its handle snapping neatly from the rim as it struck the tiled hearth. A mild commotion followed. Apologies, napkins, and reassurances that no harm had been done. But Miss Marple's interest was piqued not by the breakage itself, but by the pattern revealed in the fragments. She examined the china quietly while the others resumed their conversation. Pale ivory, with a faded cobalt band, and a delicate ring of gold fleur-de-lis, a once fine set, clearly worn by time and use. She remembered it well. Years ago, on the single occasion she had taken tea with Colonel Templeton, she had been served in precisely such a cup. It had seemed oddly grand for a bachelor, especially one of such modest means. But the Colonel had always relished the theatrical. What stirred her now was not the pattern, but the fact that she had believed the set lost. It was widely rumored in the village that, following the departure of the lost maid, Clara, the Colonel had dismissed the remainder of his household staff and sold many of the house's contents. Among these, so it was said, was the matching china. And yet, here it was, or at least, part of it, in Mrs. Dowling's possession, as though it had never left Ivy Bank House at all. Miss Marple said nothing, merely tucked the broken handle gently into her handbag, with the kind of polite indifference that drew no attention. But her thoughts stirred with quiet purpose. Objects had a way of reappearing when they shouldn't, especially when someone, somewhere, wished them to remain forgotten. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to pry, at least not in any overt manner. But there were occasions when discretion and curiosity made rather suitable companions. A week after the teacup incident, she paid a visit to Mrs. Harcourt under the pretext of returning a borrowed recipe for walnut cake. Though, truth be told, no such exchange had occurred. Mrs. Harcourt, by now accustomed to Miss Marple's gentle inquisitiveness, welcomed her in. Over a modest cup of tea they spoke of harmless things: church pew cushions, the persistent draught in the vicar's vestry. But by the time Miss Marple rose to leave, she had steered the conversation ever so delicately toward the matter of the stain beneath the rug once more. "I do wonder," she mused, "if the study might yield anything further. The Colonel was rather fond of locking things away." Mrs. Harcourt hesitated, then offered the key, remarking only that she hadn't spent much time in that room. It made her feel watched, she said, though she laughed after saying so, as though dismissing her own words. Miss Marple entered the study with a soft tread, her fingers brushing the edge of the bookshelves, the dust-laced bindings, the long-settled air. She paused near the corner where an old writing desk sat slightly askew. Something in the alignment of the floorboards beneath it troubled her. One plank, not quite even, caught her eye. She knelt, pressing lightly with her fingertips. The board gave slightly, then lifted, revealing a shallow cavity lined in dust and old paper fibers. Nestled at the base beneath the corner of a crumpled cloth lay a small shard of porcelain. She drew it out gently. It matched precisely. Same faded ivory, same cobalt band, same delicate fleck of gold, but this piece was stained, a thin edge of rust-colored residue clinging to its underside, as though it had once lain in something wet and dark and long undisturbed. Miss Marple replaced the board, wiped her gloved hands carefully, and stood. It was not proof. Not yet. But it was a whisper. And in her experience, whispers had a way of leading to truths that shouted louder than anyone dared speak aloud. The fog that drifted across Little Dithering that morning was unusually thick, curling along hedgerows and window panes, as if reluctant to lift its veil from the day. Mrs. Harcourt, rising later than usual, blamed the heaviness in the air for the dull ache in her temples, and moved about the kitchen with a sense of mild disquiet. She set the kettle to boil, fetched the Morning Post, and glanced briefly at the grandfather clock in the hall, which ticked with its customary disapproval of lateness. It was only when she entered the sitting room, half intending to replace a vase of daffodils, that she stopped short. The rug was still rolled back. This, in itself, might have meant nothing. Daniel Claiborne had expressed interest in examining the floorboards again. He had muttered something about light angles and varnish, and she had left him to it the previous evening. But it was the stillness in the room that struck her, an unnatural stillness, not of rest, but of finality. Daniel lay sprawled near the edge of the rug, his head turned awkwardly toward the fireplace. There was no blood, no struggle, nothing dramatic or theatrical, only a strange quiet, as though death itself had come gently and unannounced. Mrs. Harcourt did not scream. She backed slowly into the hall, gripped the telephone with shaking fingers, and rang the vicar first, then the constable. By the time Miss Marple arrived, having heard the whispers circulating as quickly as steam through a kettle spout, the parlor had already taken on the hush of morning. The constable, a young man with more enthusiasm than experience, paced the room solemnly, taking notes with furrowed brow. Mrs. Harcourt, white with shock, repeated herself with admirable composure, though her eyes flickered often toward the floor. Miss Marple stood quietly in the doorway, her gaze fixed not on the body, but on the rug, still rolled back, still exposing the stain that had begun this strange chapter. Death, it seemed, had returned to the very place it had once been suspected, without fanfare and without resistance. And Miss Marple, who had known more deaths than most ever spoke of, understood immediately that this one had not come of nature's hand. Constable Phelps, a serious-minded young man with the air of one who had once imagined a life in London, moved methodically through the sitting room. He examined the door latch, the window locks, the corners of the rug. He asked questions in a tone of solemn rehearsal, clearly learned from his training rather than lived experience. Mrs. Harcourt answered each politely, still trembling slightly, as she stirred her tea with a spoon she did not realize was her dessert fork. Miss Marple remained silent for the most part, observing the flow of the room with a gaze as light as dust and twice as difficult to track. She glanced at the hearth, the occasional table, the small writing desk near the window. Everything was as it had been, undisturbed, too undisturbed. A death, especially one so intimate as a blow to the head, ought to have left a ripple, a struggle, a misplaced cushion, a knocked-over vase. But there was nothing, not even the telltale draft of a forced window pane. And then she noticed the absence. The small leather-bound notebook Daniel had carried with him daily, tucked beneath his arm, scribbled in feverishly after every conversation, was missing. He had clutched it even during breakfast, turning it over like a rosary. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, adjusting the hem of her glove as though inspecting her wrist. "He kept notes, I believe," she said softly, "about the Colonel, about Clara." The constable blinked. "No notebook found at the scene, ma'am." She nodded gently, her lips forming a thin line of thought. No signs of entry, no sign of a struggle, but something very important, deliberately removed. And that, Miss Marple thought, was rarely the work of a stranger. It was the seed that gave it away. Not a metaphorical seed, though those had long been planted. A literal one, lodged in the groove of Daniel's left shoe, clinging stubbornly to the leather despite the constable's cursory glance. Miss Marple spotted it while kneeling to retrieve her handbag, which had been placed near the hearth for safekeeping. A small, dusky kernel with a frilled edge, unmistakably from the dry ground near the greenhouse, where the gardener kept bags of early sowing for spring. Most villagers would not have recognized it. But Miss Marple, who had once spent an entire summer experimenting with delphiniums, knew it well. Daniel had walked through the garden late, very late, on the night of his death, and he had not worn the same coat he had worn that afternoon. Mrs. Harcourt had mentioned that his usual tweed jacket was still hanging on the hook in the hall, untouched, which meant someone had lent him a coat, or Daniel had taken one that was not his own. Miss Marple mentioned it to the constable in passing, but he seemed distracted, focused on the post-mortem arrangements and next of kin. So she asked Elsie, the maid, in a tone that suggested curiosity more than inquiry. Elsie paled slightly. I think he borrowed one of the Colonel's old coats," she murmured, "from the wardrobe in the study. He said it would be warmer. I didn't think anything of it." But Miss Marple did, for the Colonel's coats had been packed away. Many believed donated after his death. Why one remained was itself odd. Why Daniel would choose that particular coat to walk out into the cold, even more so, unless he intended to walk in the Colonel's footsteps, or be seen as the Colonel himself. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the rug, the stain, the porcelain shard. The past had not merely returned, it had dressed itself in borrowed clothing, stepped out into the garden and whispered to the dark, and someone had heard it and responded with murder. Grief, Miss Marple had often observed, wears many disguises. Some weep theatrically and recover before the day's end. Others go quite silent, as though holding their breath for days. But Elsie's grief was of another kind entirely, a depth of sorrow that did not match the circumstances. She had not known Daniel Claiborne beyond polite conversation and the occasional tray brought up to his room. Yet, when word of his death reached her, Elsie had dissolved into trembling sobs so violent she had to be led from the room. Later she had been found in the scullery, clutching the apron she had worn the previous day, and wringing it as though it might yield some explanation. Miss Marple, who had spoken with the girl twice before, both times on quite trivial matters, now watched her from the parlor doorway. The girl's shoulders trembled with a quiet ache, not loud enough to draw attention, but sustained enough to raise a thoughtful eyebrow. It was not Daniel's death she mourned, not truly. It was something else, something older, more deeply rooted. A sorrow perhaps stirred by the death but not born of it. Grief is often the key that unlocks buried guilt, and Miss Marple suspected that the maid's sorrow came not from the event itself, but from what it had unearthed within her. And in Miss Marple's experience, maids knew more than they were ever asked, and often feared far more than they dared tell. It was just after morning prayers that Miss Marple found herself walking past the side hedge near Ivy Bank House. The air was damp with the promise of rain, and the low murmur of pruning shears could be heard among the laurels. She greeted Mr. Beechcroft, the gardener, with her customary civility, and asked in the gentlest tone whether he might spare a moment. He did, of course. Few in the village ever declined Miss Marple's polite requests. There was, after all, a great dignity in the way she asked. She inquired first after the dahlias, then after the late frost's effect on the orchard. Only after such pleasantries did she allow her gaze to wander, seemingly by accident, toward the disused path that led to the root cellar. The ivy there had thickened considerably, and the door beyond had not been opened in years. "I wonder," she said delicately, "whether Mr. Claiborne ever wandered that way. He had, I believe, an interest in architecture, and old buildings do rather draw certain types of minds." The gardener hesitated, then admitted that he had seen a light once, just a flicker, 2 evenings prior. Could have been a torch, he thought, or simply a reflection from the window, but it had seemed unusual, given the cellar's disuse. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Paths forgotten by most often remained remembered by the guilty, especially if what they hid had never been properly buried. The following afternoon found Miss Marple once again in quiet conversation with Mr. Beechcroft, the gardener, under the pretense of inquiring about rhubarb crowns. She had always believed that people reveal most when they think they're talking about something else. And Mr. Beechcroft, though not a man given to idle chatter, seemed willing enough when Miss Marple expressed admiration for the early tulip buds. "Yes, I did notice him," he said after a pause, nodding toward the overgrown path behind the orchard. "Mr. Claiborne walked out that way 2 nights before the trouble. Not many do these days. Bit wild now." His tone was cautious but not evasive. Miss Marple, ever alert to the difference, responded only with a mild, She let the silence bloom as she so often did, and presently he added, "Had a book in his hand, or a journal of some sort. Wasn't looking at the plants, though. Just stood there, like he was trying to remember something." Miss Marple thanked him politely and turned her attention to the path in question. The greenhouse had long since fallen into disuse. It had once been the pride of Colonel Templeton's estate, a hothouse for rare orchids and ferns. But since his death it had become more a relic than a retreat. Still, something about Daniel's choice to go there, deliberately and alone, had meaning, especially when viewed through the lens of what Miss Marple now suspected. The past had its roots in odd places, and it was often in the neglected corners of a garden that secrets lay furthest buried. With Mrs. Harcourt's permission, granted with a mixture of nervous curiosity and deference, Miss Marple made her way to the old greenhouse the next morning. The door creaked upon opening, and the interior, though dusty, retained a surprising sense of order, as though someone had cared for it in quiet, private moments. A bench stood along the back wall, half obscured by an overturned watering can and a long disused potting tray. Miss Marple's gaze settled not on the structure, but on the cushion that lay upon the bench. Sun-faded, certainly, and moth-nibbled at the edges, but recently straightened, almost lovingly so. She brushed off a light layer of dust, and with her fingers traced a faint set of initials, stitched into the corner. D.C. The stitching was crude in technique, but fresh in color. The thread hadn't faded as the surrounding fabric had. Someone had added the initials recently. Daniel Claiborne's. There could be no doubt. The cushion itself may have been years old, but the monogramming suggested a personal claim, a place he had returned to often, perhaps secretly. Miss Marple turned it over and noted a torn seam crudely mended, as though someone unfamiliar with the original structure had attempted a repair. A thread, literal and figurative, pulled itself forward in her mind. Why had Daniel been coming here? It was not for leisure, not for botany. There had been something purposeful in his actions, something far more connected to the Colonel's legacy than mere historical research. The greenhouse had served as a private refuge, but perhaps it had also served as a vault, one only Daniel knew how to open. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the cushion's edge. The fabric, though aged, had once borne weight. Just like memory, just like guilt, it was the uneven sound beneath the bench that caught her attention. A faint thud as she shifted the cushion. Miss Marple, who had spent many years understanding the language of domestic creaks and hollow echoes, tapped gently along the wooden slats and found what she sought, a panel loose at one corner. With some effort and care not to splinter the old wood, she lifted it free. Inside the narrow compartment lay a bundle wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine so delicate it crumbled at her touch. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently, revealing a small cloth-bound book, yellowed, the spine worn, the corners soft with use. A diary. No lock, no adornment. Just a plain brown cover with faint indentations on the front, where a name had once been inscribed and then, perhaps purposefully, rubbed away. She opened it. The handwriting was slanted and graceful, though occasionally hurried, as if emotion had outrun grammar. The first entries were unremarkable, accounts of household tasks, observations of the weather, occasional mentions of the Colonel's eccentric habits. But as she read further, the tone shifted. Clara. It was her voice that breathed life into the pages. Clara had loved someone, perhaps foolishly, perhaps dangerously. The diary made no effort to disguise the intensity of her feelings, nor did it flinch from the reality of her situation. A maid in a household governed by appearances, by inherited silence, by carefully constructed respectability. There had been a promise, made, then withdrawn. A letter she had never received, And most damning of all, a secret she had carried in her body. A child, unnamed and unacknowledged. Fear of disgrace haunted every line. The Colonel, she believed, knew. And worse, he had acted. Not with violence, at least not that she described, but with pressure, with silence, with money, and a warning. Miss Marple closed the diary gently, one hand resting upon its cover. Clara's words had survived, and in surviving, they had named what no one else had dared to say aloud. But the final page had not yet been turned. The final pages of the diary bore a tremor that had not been present in the early entries. The handwriting, while still legible, had grown erratic. Strokes longer, pressure deeper, as though the pen itself had been gripped in haste. She had discovered something. Clara had written of a conversation overheard outside the study. Voices raised, then quickly hushed. A mention of names, of payments, of keeping quiet, and of someone else. A woman. A rival. A protector. The diary gave no clear name, only an initial. Clara had feared she would be blamed. For what, she did not say. But there was a finality to her thoughts, a sense that she no longer intended to remain silent. If anyone finds this, the final entry read, "No, I never meant to fall in love, but I won't be quiet anymore. Tonight I tell her." There was no her named, no closure. The diary ended abruptly, the final sentence trailing off beneath a blot of ink. No date, no farewell. Miss Marple closed the book with care, her hands lingering upon it, as though to absorb the weight of its silence. It had not been finished, not by Clara, not by those who had known her, but Daniel had found it. Of that, she was certain. And now Daniel was dead. Miss Marple looked out toward the garden beyond the greenhouse, where lilacs stirred faintly in the wind. The story had waited years to be heard. But the truth, Miss Marple believed, would not wait much longer. The arrival of Lady Honoria Wellfleet in Little Dithering was marked by restrained curiosity rather than overt excitement. Hers was a presence of cultivated elegance, the sort commonly found in portrait halls and private salons. Yet beneath her genteel bearing, there stirred something sharper, something distinctly purposeful. She took lodgings at the village's small inn, causing a ripple of intrigue that promptly spilled into the vicarage parlor, the post office queue, and Mrs. Fitch's grocery counter. It was soon known, through the swift transmission that only village gossip could manage, that Lady Honoria was interested in the late Colonel Templeton's lineage, ostensibly as research for her genealogical interests. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, merely raised an eyebrow. The Colonel, she recalled, had often boasted of grand relations, though rarely substantiated by proof. Still, visitors with titles rarely traveled merely to confirm distant family connections. In Miss Marple's experience, silk often concealed more secrets than sackcloth. Lady Honoria moved smoothly through the village, making polite but direct inquiries. Her voice carried the faintest trace of authority, her questions artful in their indirectness. She asked about family papers, portraits, and past domestic arrangements. She seemed particularly interested in the Templeton household staff. A curious interest, thought Miss Marple, especially given that Lady Honoria's own family was reputedly far removed from the Colonel's rather modest sphere. Yet Lady Honoria's charm was effective. She disarmed suspicion with a gracious ease, and a smile that conveyed both kindness and subtle impatience, as if there were more pressing matters to resolve. Miss Marple, quietly observing from the sidelines of village social life, recognized this urgency. She understood that Lady Honoria had come not to uncover mere genealogical tidbits, but to discover, or perhaps conceal, something of far greater consequence. Secrets, after all, rarely lay dormant. They tended to follow their keepers until discovered, and Miss Marple had begun to suspect that Lady Honoria's arrival signified a deeper stirring, one that might finally draw out the truth from its hiding place. The following afternoon, the vicarage once again hosted tea, ostensibly as a gesture of welcome for Lady Honoria. The warmth of the day pressed gently upon the gathering, yet Lady Honoria maintained her immaculate poise, her hands elegantly gloved in pale lavender silk, despite the rising temperature. Miss Marple noticed the incongruity, for gloves worn indoors in such warmth hinted at more than mere fashion. As conversation drifted easily through pleasantries and polite exchanges, Lady Honoria turned her focus towards the Colonel's era at Ivy Bank House. Her manner remained impeccable, but beneath it lay a probing intent. Then, casually, almost incidentally, Lady Honoria quoted a phrase. "I never meant to fall in love, but I won't be quiet anymore." The words hung softly upon the air, innocuous enough on their own, yet startlingly familiar to Miss Marple, who recognized them instantly as Clara's private lament, words she had read the mere days before in the hidden diary. No one else appeared to notice the significance. Mrs. Dowling commented gently on the poetic sentiment. The vicar nodded vaguely in agreement. But Miss Marple's attention was fully sharpened, her mind suddenly alert to the delicacy of the moment. How had Lady Honoria come to know words written privately, tucked away for decades, and only recently discovered? Lady Honoria's gaze drifted briefly across Miss Marple's face. Their eyes met, each recognizing in the other something more acute than polite interest. Miss Marple quietly considered possibilities. Could Lady Honoria have had previous knowledge of Clara's diary? Had she read it before? Or had someone else? Clara's final words, so desperately sincere, now carried an added resonance. They had not merely been preserved in ink, but spoken again decades later by a stranger whose graceful presence was slowly revealing itself to be something far more complicated. And with quiet clarity, Miss Marple realized that Lady Honoria was not here merely to observe or research. She had come already informed, armed with secrets not openly shared, secrets that could connect the present to the painful past, in ways Miss Marple was only now beginning to discern. It was after tea that Miss Marple approached Lady Honoria discreetly, away from general conversation. Her manner remained cordial, her tone pleasant. She spoke briefly of Ivy Bank House and its eccentric former occupant. Lady Honoria listened with attentive politeness, but there was something rehearsed in her responses, an elegance too carefully maintained. Lady Honoria mentioned, almost casually, that she had once been a guest of Colonel Templeton. Years earlier, of course, and only briefly. Miss Marple, who possessed a formidable memory for village social calendars and neighborhood visits, found no recollection to support the claim. The Colonel had seldom been detained, and never without village awareness. Further gentle inquiries produced only polished evasions, answers too smooth to hold sincerity. Lady Honoria spoke fluently of the Colonel's hobbies, his books and curios, yet avoided precise details of dates, events, or specifics that might invite confirmation. The more Lady Honoria talked, the more evident became the careful structure of her tale, finely crafted but curiously hollow. Miss Marple recognized the art of deflection when she saw it. Lady Honoria's narrative was beautifully lacquered but fundamentally insubstantial, designed to reassure without revealing. A polite fiction, thought Miss Marple, but fiction nonetheless. She listened attentively, outwardly amiable, inwardly vigilant. Lady Honoria's interest in Clara had not been incidental, her mention of the diary's words not accidental. It had been a subtle provocation, perhaps intended to gauge reactions or measure the awareness of those present. What remained unclear was Lady Honoria's motive. Was she protecting someone? Or herself? Did her polished veneer conceal personal involvement, or merely knowledge withheld? As Lady Honoria withdrew gracefully, leaving the vicarage parlor filled with admiration but no answers, Miss Marple stood thoughtful, acutely aware that the strands of past deceit were tightening. A lie, however elegantly spoken, rarely remained intact under scrutiny. Lady Honoria had stirred the hidden truths of Ivy Bankhouse, and Miss Marple now watched, quietly resolved, as the past began to slip slowly from its carefully tailored silk gloves. Lady Honoria Wellfleet departed the vicarage with the graceful ease that had marked her every movement since her arrival in Little Dithering. She offered a polite smile to each guest, nodded courteously to the vicar's wife, and paused just briefly to thank Miss Marple, whose clear blue eyes held a gaze steady and thoughtful in return. Lady Honoria's expression was carefully neutral, elegantly distant, as she stepped through the doorway. It was only after she had gone that Miss Marple noticed something, lying unobtrusively on the polished wooden floor, a small rectangle of crisp white card, edged delicately in silver gilt. The calling card had slipped, perhaps carelessly, perhaps deliberately, from Lady Honoria's gloved fingers. Miss Marple bent slightly and retrieved it, her own expression betraying nothing more than mild curiosity. The front was immaculate, bearing Lady Honoria's name in discreet lettering, simple and tasteful. But as Miss Marple turned it gently over, her eyes narrowed slightly at the faint pencil scrawl across the reverse. Clara's child survived. The words were written hastily but with distinct purpose. They had the air of something dashed off quickly, a secretive reminder never intended to be seen by anyone else. Miss Marple's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the card. So, Clara's child had lived, survived the scandal, the silence, and the shame. Daniel Claiborne's death suddenly became more pointed. His presence, his questions, the notebook, all converging sharply into clarity. Daniel had been Clara's child, seeking the truth, searching for answers deliberately hidden, answers Lady Honoria had known, or discovered. Miss Marple tucked the card quietly into the pocket of her cardigan. The past had indeed spoken louder than any voice, and now it demanded not only to be heard, but to be understood. Lady Honoria Wellfleet had always moved with a poised certainty, a grace born from generations of carefully curated dignity. Now, however, that dignity seemed strained, not broken precisely, but tempered by inevitability. When Constable Phelps arrived to escort her quietly from the inn, she neither protested nor questioned. Her lavender gloves were immaculate, her silk gown impeccable, and her demeanor serene, as though she had rehearsed this moment countless times in anticipation. Outside the inn, villagers watched discreetly from windows and doorways, their expressions curious yet solemn. Miss Marple observed silently, understanding that justice, when finally delivered, often lacked the theatrical flourish of imagination. It was instead quiet, understated, and starkly simple. Lady Honoria did not meet anyone's eye directly, nor did she speak a single word of explanation or defense. Her gaze remained distant, fixed on something invisible and private. Her secrets, long guarded beneath silken politeness and perfect manners, now unraveled quietly beneath public scrutiny. As the constable guided her gently toward the waiting car, Miss Marple noticed the older woman's gaze briefly alight on Ivy Bankhouse, her expression unreadable. A momentary tightening of her lips was the only acknowledgement that within those walls lay the origin of her undoing. Then Lady Honoria was gone, the car moving slowly down the lane, leaving behind only whispers, quiet murmurs of speculation, and the lingering echo of the past. Justice had come to Little Dithering, not with fury or fanfare, but softly, as a visitor who had been expected all along, finally claiming its seat at the table. In the days that followed Lady Honoria's departure, Little Dithering slipped quietly back into the rhythms it knew best. Tea at the vicarage, post collected promptly, and gardens attended to meticulously. Yet beneath the veneer of normality, there lingered an unmistakable solemnity. The villagers, having glimpsed the truth hidden beneath layers of genteel discretion, moved about their lives with a subdued gravity. They exchanged polite greetings in softer tones, their conversations now gentle and mindful of a truth they had all quietly suspected but never dared voice aloud. Mrs. Dowling resumed her afternoon teas, though fewer attended. The vicar preached sermons on forgiveness, perhaps choosing his themes carefully. Even Mrs. Fitch at the grocer's weighed sugar and tea leaves, with a gentler hand, her eyes thoughtful, as she tied parcels neatly. Miss Marple understood this new quietness profoundly. She recognized the weight it carried, the weight of shared knowledge, an unspoken understanding that even in a village built on traditions and polite fictions, the past would always find its way forward, inevitably, and without mercy. The quiet whispers of Little Dithering spoke now not merely of idle gossip, but of deeper truths that had tested and ultimately strengthened the fabric of their small society. Each villager, in their own way, adjusted to this subdued atmosphere, knowing that something hidden had finally been brought to gentle, if painful, clarity. Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt stood alone in her sitting room, her eyes fixed thoughtfully upon the now polished floorboards. The stain remained, faint yet indelible, a mark that resisted every effort to remove it completely. She bent quietly and replaced the heavy rug, smoothing it with gentle precision over the polished wood. Yet after a moment's hesitation she stepped back, leaving one corner purposefully turned up. It was a deliberate choice, one made not from forgetfulness, but from quiet resolution, a gesture of remembrance and acknowledgement, a subtle defiance against secrecy. The stain would remain partially exposed, a small reminder of truths too important to hide completely. Miss Marple, upon hearing of this simple gesture, nodded approvingly. In her view, the rug symbolized everything the village had grappled with, the delicate balance between appearances and reality. It was appropriate, she thought, to leave the corner turned up, a quiet symbol to remind anyone who cared to notice that some things ought never to be fully covered again. Life, after all, required honesty, even in its small domestic rituals. The rug was no longer just a rug, nor the stain merely a stain. Both had become quiet symbols of a truth that had once waited patiently beneath layers of polite concealment, and now had chosen, quietly, yet insistently, to be acknowledged. In the quiet sanctuary of her garden, Miss Marple sat contentedly, her fingers moving methodically through a tangle of wool. The flowers around her bloomed gently, their petals open to the soft warmth of the afternoon sun. Yet her mind was far from idle, dwelling reflectively upon the events recently unfolded. She thought of Clara, whose truth had finally emerged from silence. She considered Daniel, whose quest for understanding had cost him dearly. And she reflected on Lady Honoria, whose polished facade had ultimately cracked beneath the weight of long-hidden secrets. Justice, Miss Marple mused quietly, was not always swift, nor was it always neat or tidy. Often it moved quietly, unseen beneath the everyday patterns of life, slowly gathering strength until the moment of revelation. The village had learned that truth, once buried, was never truly silent. It persisted, quiet yet powerful, whispering patiently until it was heard. She glanced thoughtfully towards Ivy Bank House, visible through the trees, now quiet once more. Beneath its calm exterior lay a lesson. One little dithering would not soon forget. Unseen truths, like hidden seeds beneath the soil, would always find their way upward, drawn inevitably towards light. With a gentle sigh, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles providing a soothing cadence. She understood that human nature, with its weaknesses and quiet strengths, never truly changed, and she found comfort in knowing that, as surely as her garden bloomed each spring, truth and justice would continue quietly, inexorably, to make their way forward, beneath rugs, beneath silks, beneath secrets, and finally, inevitably, beneath the careful scrutiny of eyes willing to see. As Miss Marple sat knitting quietly among her flowers, we were gently reminded that beneath even the most polished surfaces, hidden truths wait patiently to be revealed. Secrets, it seems, have a way of surfacing, quietly, inevitably, reminding us that justice is rarely swift or dramatic, but instead moves at its own deliberate pace. Perhaps the true measure of wisdom lies in understanding that nothing stays buried forever, and that our choices, whether honest or hidden, always leave their mark. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.